Welcome to DECODED, Series 1, Episode 5, your weekly podcast providing in-depth insight into cybersecurity. Show notes, including any links mentioned in the show, are available at decodedcyber.com. I'm Simon Edwards, CEO and founder of SE Labs, the world's leading security testing lab. I've been advising on security for over 20 years.
And I'm Mark Briggs, with over 10 years' experience as a British Army officer and 5 years in cybersecurity. I'm now the COO of SE Labs.
In this episode, we take a deep dive into the world of security testing, and what we talk about might surprise you. We'll kick off by introducing our first guest, someone with a unique perspective on the testing world. Allison Elizondo, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Alison, you have worked in security testing in the past?
Yeah, that's right. I spent about 4 years at a pretty well-known test lab called NSS Labs, and they closed last year around October.
And so as with any test lab, NSS and SE Labs and the others, we look at security products to assess their effectiveness. Would you say that most test labs work entirely independently?
Entirely independently, I guess.
It's a loaded
there's
question.
a lot in that question. I think that we're human, right? And these test labs are run by human beings, and I guess it's impossible not to be influenced by certain experiences, maybe that you might have with certain vendors. And I think more than anything, versus how much that vendor might invest in engaging that test lab, I think the experience that the test lab has with that vendor might feed into their opinion. And of course, if the tech works, that's always a plus.
There are only a few security test labs that we're aware of in existence. How important is it that people are keeping an eye on the different security products available and seeing how effective they are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's critical. And I think that labs like SE Labs and others are very important just in that sort of, ecosystem. It keeps us all honest. It holds us accountable. And in the age of, the online review, the customers are really the ones selling your product. So transparency is important. So I think there's a very important place for test labs.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Trustpilot might be good enough if you want to buy some shoes or a hat, but spending $1 million on a firewall, it's harder to get a sense of what's realistically good or not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just too important.
And I guess with the test labs, they give that independent perspective, because when you are an enterprise business that's looking to spend upwards of $1 million on a firewall, or you've got to take your decision making from the marketing and sales departments of the security vendors, which are naturally biased and will push their own products without that independent bias.
Yeah, I think independence is crucial, but how can you judge that? If we the testers sit there in judgment of everybody else and how effective they are, how can people tell that we're actually honest, ethical, and competent?
That's a good question. I guess maybe it starts in my head, maybe with even the way that the test lab monetizes. I mean, that can say a lot about how you're influenced, I suppose. It's tricky though. If your business model is set up in a way that completely relies on the vendors that you test, that could put you in a precarious position. If you could imagine that you're beholden somewhat, to the vendor community for your business.
Yeah, it's who watches the watchers, isn't it? I think one way to get past that, because a lot of testing has to involve the vendors, whether they're paying money or not, is transparency.
Right.
So saying what you're going to do and then doing it and being prepared to prove it, I think that gets rid of a lot of the fear. I think there are some people who will always assume that testers are in the vendors' pockets. There are some people who will always assume that testing isn't very effective or can't even be done. I've heard that before, that it's not even possible to test products. The old previous CEO of FireEye has famously said, well, you can't test us, it's not possible, just spend however many millions, I might be paraphrasing, buy our product basically and see the benefit, feel the quality.
Yeah, just trust us.
Yeah. But I think just being honest and open and putting your hand up when you make mistakes or acknowledging the limitation of your results as well. I mean, I remember tests from the old days where the tester would do one thing and then draw conclusions that didn't really match what they'd done. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. And one thing I would try, and, during my time at NSS, I led the vendor relations team. And I always felt that it was important to prepare the vendors well for the experience they were about to have, because it's time consuming. It's very, very, intense. And one way that I would try and get them ready for that experience was to make sure they had the right mindset. I think if you go into this with a healthy mindset as a vendor, thinking to yourself, okay, we're going to be focused, we're going to be organized, we're going to get everything, squeeze every piece of value out of this test experience that we can. It's going to help make our product better, and then if you kind of go into it with that attitude, you just get, as a vendor, a lot more out of the experience. And then over time, that rapport starts to build between the vendor and the test organization.
Actually, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because when we've run projects that have been entirely marketing led, it's always been a disaster, because the idea that a vendor will always get exactly the results that they want for marketing purposes is quite low, because no product is perfect.
That's right.
But if you're focusing on improving the product, then it's a win-win. Either the product does really well, in which case, great, have a badge, do a podcast, or it doesn't, in which case, well, there's some work to be done, but we're improving things, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and I think the customer, at least I'm a customer of some things, and I always appreciate that transparency to say, hey, we have a great product, it's not perfect. Here are the ways in which it isn't perfect, and we're addressing that for you, the customer. I think that's a healthy. Yeah.
I forgot, because you used to work for Tester, I forgot you actually work for a vendor now.
I do. I'm on the other side. Yeah.
So you've obviously worked with different testers, and I just to give people outside of this weird little world that we occupy a sense of how things are. How does it feel to be a vendor? And then some people either come to you and cooperate, and some people maybe operate more on their own. How does that feel from your side?
Well, I think because of the time that I spent on the other side, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I do analyst relations for a company called SentinelOne, and the analyst relations versus the test lab experience are similar, but not the same. But the mindset is very similar. So coming from a test organization, having seen some of the mistakes that the vendors would make and the things I'd need to kind of coach them on, I kind of have that toolbox in hand. And now that I'm sitting on the vendor side, I can help prepare our engineers and leadership to go into an engagement like that with the right kind of attitude, really the right mindset. And that's helpful, because I've got that really kind of compassion for the vendors that I saw go through some interesting challenges with NSS. And now that I'm on the other side, I can kind of coach according to that, that context.
So if somebody came along and said to you, I'm going to make a new security testing firm, give me some advice. What should I do to make you, the potential client, kind of relax and trust me and participate properly?
Well, the first question is, who do you think is your client, and how are you monetizing, right? So you kind of have to figure out in your head, who's my customer? Is it the end user? Is it the vendor? It really should be the end user. If we're really engaged in a virtuous cycle, we're starting with the customer's needs always. And that should be part of your mindset as a vendor. This is about the customer, not you at the end of the day. But I think that's just a good way to kind of level set before you go into and engage, to kind of build out a test organization. It's who's my customer. Once you kind of figure that out, that it needs to be, the end user versus the vendor, you figure out how you want to kind of monetize and build out that business. And then I would say get a team together, call it your, vendor experience team, your VX team, because the vendor's experience is very important, just as important as the end users that you're helping. you need to provide a good experience for the vendors. So make that a focus as well.
Okay, so when we've worked together before, and I think you've told me it wasn't a horrible experience. What did we do right? What would you recommend other people copy to make it a good vendor experience?
Yeah, well, I think you guys do a great job of just being open and transparent. Even if let's say there's something about a test that you haven't quite perfected, you're honest about that. We're working on that. Here's some ideas we have for tests coming up, and you engage the vendor community in that conversation. I think it's very important to make the vendors a part of that kind of journey when it comes to the tests themselves. Obviously, you don't want vendors building out your tests or influencing them in a way that's possibly gaming the system for their own benefit. But I think it's important to kind of bring them along that journey, and you guys do a good job of that.
I was going to ask, because we do talk to everybody, we talk to the end customers, the people that buy the stuff, but we are also heavily involved in the vendor community. Does that not kind of make us inherently biased in some way? We're kind of in the old boys club,
I don't look at it that way. I see it more as collaboration, and I think collaboration is very important because at the end of the day, aren't we all fighting the same battle, like the same criminals, the same, we're trying to do the right thing together. And I think it's important that we collaborate. I think, collaboration versus, partnership is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. I think it helps that the problem we're all trying to solve is so hard that no one company or person can do it on their own. I think even vendors collaborate with each other because the challenge of cybersecurity is so insane.
Absolutely. Yeah, big problems can't be solved in a silo. We have to work together.
And that's true in many areas of life.
Well, what about right now with COVID? These different around the world, these organizations that are working together to help solve this giant problem that we all have.
Yeah, and there are still some people, lots of people who have got a big conspiracy theory about that, haven't they? They just don't trust vaccines in the same way that we could do the most perfect unbiased test in the world. And the minute the report comes out, the forums are full of people saying, "Oh, it's all corrupt and terrible."
Oh, it's something else. Yeah, and I fight against that too in my role. That's one of those little subtle things that you do have to address with like your sales teams. You don't want them, disparaging or talking down about a test result or things like that. That's important as well.
I know that there's an organization that many people won't have heard of called the Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization, or AMTSO. If I had my time at the beginning, I would have named it differently. But they've got a testing standard which is quite interesting, and it's to do with transparency. So they don't tell you technically how to do a test. They tell you how to kind of behave around a test, which is to sort of, as the way I summarize it, is say what you're going to do it, and then be prepared to prove it. But not very many testers follow that. Have any thoughts on why that might be?
Well, I can speak from my own experiences at NSS Labs. I think they were very hardcore into being the hacker and thinking like an adversary thinks, and they're not going to be transparent necessarily and be forthcoming in their methods. Hey, we're going to attack you. Here's how we're going to do it. And so NSS Labs was sort of the mindset of, well, that's not how hackers behave. So that's how we're kind of going to lean into our own kind of approach, is by being very closed. Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it does illustrate how some of the testers have misunderstood the goals there, because what you can do is you can say, we are going to test a product and we're going to attack it, and we're not going to tell you how we're going to attack it. And actually that's a good enough description. You don't have to outline everything that you're going to do in detail. And actually one of the good things about the standard is even a really bad test can pass, because so long as you say what you're going to do, even if it's completely arbitrary and stupid, the fact that you've said it is enough. And the point is that then people can read that report and read the methodology and go, this is stupid. I'm not going to give any credibility to the results.
Well, yeah, and I think if we all follow a standard, that, a customer, an end user can also understand. Like, I mean, if we're not following standards, and let's say someone's running a test that they're giving no visibility into how they're testing whatsoever, why should the customer trust the results? It has to be transparent. And AMSO helps to kind of keep everyone within those healthy kind of guardrails.
Yeah, I think that's right. You've got the vendors are always held in a bit of suspicion. Do they really do what they say they do? I think the same should be held against the testers. Why should we get away with a free pass and not have to explain ourselves?
I completely agree. I think, for example, an MQ on test labs would be interesting, or some sort of, comparison. But yeah, AMSO does a great job of kind of keeping everyone on the level. But yeah, it's difficult. Why should a customer trust a test lab that is completely opaque in their methods? But they do. They trusted an organization that was rather opaque in their methods for a long time.
I think there isn't a lot of competition. I think that's part of the problem. Not much choice.
Absolutely. Well, it's hard. I mean, I'm sure you could testify it's a difficult business to be in, and you have to really be passionate.
It is, and then you bring analysts into the mix.
To me, testing is, it answers that question. Okay, does it work? And then the analyst answers the question, does it work for me if I'm an enterprise?
Right, and that actually brings us quite nicely to how does security sell in the market? Because the analysts are really important. They sit right in the middle of the whole process, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah, and they are trusted 100% by these companies.
Yeah, and we talk to the main analysts. I won't necessarily say their names, but essentially they have opinions based on the deep research that they do and the conversations they have with the vendors, but they don't generally get hands-on with the products, and so the main ones will use us to be kind of their external lab, if you like, and give them data, and they really care about the details.
Interesting. So how does that work? How do the analysts connect with these test labs to kind of, do they vet them out? Like, what's your experience there?
I think probably it's word of mouth initially, and then as the AMSO thing kicked off, they started, certainly Gartner started to assess the testers based on their transparency. And I there was at one point adherence to the AMTSO guidelines or standard was one of the criteria. So SE Labs did very well on that one, and right. Nobody else really did. But there were other things like, do they publish methodologies, and how detailed are those methodologies, that kind of thing. Because again, you can't say that one test is necessarily better than the other, but it can be better described, and conclusions can be more realistic in some cases
Absolutely.
than others. So Alison, I've never worked for an analyst, or particularly with analysts. So how does it work? Do they talk to customers and vendors in certain ways? Where does the money and the time flow?
They do talk to customers, and that's a lot. And that's why it's so important that, vendors understand that this is the way that analysts work. So a customer who's making a buying decision, who's probably gone through your sales cycle, and, depending on where they are in their buying process, they'll reach out to a Gartner, sometimes a Forrester, but oftentimes it's Gartner, and ask to speak with an analyst and get their opinion on whoever the vendors are on their short list. And that's called an Analyst Inquiry, and those are not inexpensive. Normally, this is an engagement that a company can use if they're already like a Gartner client. They're not normally just one-offs. So yeah, it's a paid engagement. It's called an inquiry, and they have 30 minutes to talk to an analyst. And that analyst, depending on what the question is, will advise them accordingly based on their needs, their environment, their problems, all that good stuff.
So we can see that it's not just as simple as reading some reviews and then spending millions on endpoint and network security.
We've put these diagrams and notes in the show notes of this episode, but we have a concept of how cybersecurity sells the way that people think it does, and then with our kind of inside industry knowledge, how we think it really does. So generally speaking, what people think happens is that vendors talk to the analysts, as Alison just said. The analysts talk to the media, computer magazines, business magazines, websites, that kind of thing. And that information flows to the customer one way or another, who then go and make a massive multi-dollar purchase at a vendor. But it's not quite as simple as that. And in reality, there's a real web of time and money and misinformation and back briefings and all sorts of things flowing all the way around. So when the customer does spend a big chunk of money with a security vendor, lots of other things have happened in the background. So for example, a pretty common situation would be a large bank is thinking about switching from one firewall vendor to another. So they don't just listen to the two firewall vendors, they go and talk to other people. They'll talk to Gartner and Forrester. In fact, in many cases, when I've been involved in these things, their shortlist has been specifically the Gartner quadrant, the magic quadrant, where different products appear with different strengths and weaknesses. And if it's in the top right-hand side of the quadrant, then it's considered to be good in all sorts of different ways. So what we find is they'll say, well, we're thinking of vendor X and Y. Can you recommend anything else, Simon and team? But it's got to be in that top right quadrant. So already the analysts are heavily affecting the buying decision. And then you have what most people call a POC, or a proof of concept, where the customer will talk to the different vendors involved, get hold of the products, the vendor will do some tests and show that it works really, really well, and then the buyer, the customer, has to make a decision. But they can't really trust that, because each vendor is only going to show their product in the best possible light. And at that stage, increasingly what we're finding is the customer themselves are coming to us and asking us for like a second or third opinion. So we will then do our own POC, a private test, using targeted attacks and all sorts of cool hackery type techniques, and we will explain to the customer how well the product works. And one of the benefits of that is we don't just do a general test using default settings, we can use the bank's own configuration. And in some cases, they may even have multiple products installed, in which case we can test the product that they're thinking of using against the one that they already do, but there can be other products in that security stack already there. So one antivirus might work really well for one person, but you might not even need half of its features if they've already got some other products in place, and they're not going to change that. So working directly for the customer is quite a new thing, I think, for any test lab, because a lot of these guys already have their own in-house labs where they can do their security testing. But cybersecurity testing is so hard, so specific, that actually involving a third party is quite useful. And in some cases, we've come in and had a different conclusion to the in-house team, and it's been eye-raising, and they've actually not only thrown away the product they were using, but in one case notoriously asked for a refund. So I think third-party testing has a really big and increasingly important role in helping customers make those huge buying decisions where it's multiple millions of dollars. And that is one way. I mean, Alison, you said earlier on about how do you monetize. That is one way where a tester can fund the research and the work that they do without taking money from the vendors directly, which can seem problematic.
How does the media involved?
The media generally listen, I think, to the vendors. So the large security companies, the antivirus guys, whoever, will go out and start talking about the latest threats, the latest viruses, that kind of thing. And the assumption is always, well, if they're talking about it, they must be able to protect against it as well. So the stories will be written about the latest threats, and there'll be spokespeople from the media there. And I think the hope is it's a thought leadership thing, that when a CISO and his team, her team, come to buy a large set of products, in the back of their minds, they've already heard Fred from vendor A talking about bad things, so they must be competent at dealing with that. In the same way that you have threat research teams at vendors discovering all sorts of really cool stuff, and you think, why are you writing about this? It kind of goes down to competition. Why are they giving away their secrets? Mm-hmm. But these aren't actually the people that work on the product. So if I was a firewall company, I would actually hire a bunch of weird security guys and put them in a room and get them to write blog posts about what's happening out there. But that information doesn't always go into the product. That's just to make us, the vendor, look good and switched on, and we've got a really good threat intelligence kind of handle on the world.
So don't believe the media.
What I found, I used to be a journalist for many years, 20 years, and I covered computer security. So I think I understand it reasonably well, hopefully, because I run a company that tests it. And when I see the media covering cybersecurity, and particularly the mainstream media, actually, it's a bit wrong often. And that makes me worry that there are areas that I don't understand to this depth where I trust the media. I'm definitely not anti-media. Journalists are under a lot of pressure to get stuff out, and they do their best to understand it. But I think with most subjects where there is depth, the subtleties always get lost. And sometimes the subtleties are really important.
Josh, I agree. So often you hear the media talking cybersecurity and you're almost like cringing because you can tell they're just struggling to understand what's coming out of their mouth.
We also see specific stories because there's so many different media outlets available now with connections globally, and journalists under such a pressure to get articles out. We've found that we'll write an article and then within 24 hours that has multiplied exponentially around the world, because the journalists have just copied what we're saying, and it doesn't take in our case we back up all of our information with our test data, but it wouldn't take much for just a interested amateur to write an article and make claims to get picked up in the same way, and then suddenly you're perpetuating misinformation, but unwittingly as a journalist.
Actually, that's a really interesting point, that when all the vendors and the testers got together years ago to work out how could we make testing better, one of the big enemies that was perceived were these random internet reviews, often on YouTube, where no one really knew who these people were. So they'd take some viruses, whatever they were, and scan them with 3 different antivirus products and say, well, Symantec is obviously rubbish and Kaspersky is brilliant, or vice versa, whoever was behind those reviews. So yeah, it's that lack of transparency again, isn't it? If you write some kind of weird article that's not very well done about testing and it gets picked up by a journalist without double checking, then that's a disaster. And luckily, we have started to notice that some media outlets are paying attention to certifications and methodologies and things. So there's a big one in the UK called IDG. They do a lot of computer magazines over here, and they only or mainly trust our results because of our AMSO affiliation. So no journalist is going to sit down and read an antivirus testing methodology. That's too much to hope for. But having a badge, if you like, saying these guys are open and transparent, that definitely helps.
Yeah, and then again, it goes back to why test labs like SE Labs are so critical, because it's easy to pull the wool over someone's eyes if they don't really know what you're talking about. If they just shake their head, yeah, that sounds about right. So we need labs like yours to come in and actually kind of put those products through the ringer.
It sounds like security testing is a critical part of keeping everyone safe from cyber threats. But we're testers, or ex-testers in Alison's case. So what do the real customers, the ones who spend literally trillions each year on cybersecurity, what do they think? Our next guest is Nabil Kokar, a specialist security advisor who's worked with the largest companies in the world, helping them buy security products. Thanks for joining us, Nabil. Could you tell the listeners what you do?
Yeah, so basically, from my perspective, DarkGuard, we provide boutique cybersecurity strategy and solutions to organizations that require our services. And what we found is that there's a real specialist need for product and vendor selection. I think customers are getting to the point now where they're able to see past snake oil and understand that, it's not just about the branding.
Are you suggesting that cybersecurity has an element of dishonesty in its marketing?
I would say so. I would say so. And the reason for that is because I've personally been burnt at many companies, organizations where I was an employee, where we've done the analysis, we've gone and bought the reports, we've bought the industry specialism guidance, and you put it in your environment, and it just simply doesn't work. So how do you deal with that? How do you go back to your C-level and say, yeah, we spent 50,000 evaluating this, and actually, our analysis shows us that this isn't what we should buy, even though this is what you want us to buy, right?
Why do you think, or how do you think they come to the conclusions that they should buy product X?
Peer network, and in the pre-COVID days, the glamorous world of conferences and events, where hundreds, millions, billions was spent on marketing, and we've seen a paradigm shift in the last year or so, where you just don't have that ability to execute anymore. Now we speak over Zoom. You give me an environment, and I play around with it with a pre-sales person, and then I make a decision, which to me has brought a lot more transparency and honesty to the game.
So if someone is sponsoring a sports team, that no longer gives the heavy implication that their security products work properly.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Now, I don't need to do the dance and pony show. Now it's quite easy to get, let's say, a cloud first platform, get given a demo account, log in, play with it, and see what I can see. So
if you go to RSA conference and you think in the back of your head, the top 3 companies you want to maybe be involved with, can it really be down to who puts on the best party and has the most champagne that could be enough to sway you and go, well, I think they're probably all about right, but that sales team were really nice to me?
What that showed was the notion around having the financial backing. So you think to yourself, well, if you're putting across this show, then maybe you're going to put that much effort into customer success. You're going to put that into research development. So it shows that the money is there, right? So the VCs are satisfied. So you clinched your Series C, Series D, and now you're worth 3-5 billion, whatever. That at the conference kind of had some kudos. Now we don't think of it because we're not wowed by the fireworks, the shows, and Imagine Dragons coming up on stage. Right? Now it's all I've got is the platform. I go in, see how it works.
So really, for the emperor to have apparently wearing clothes, you have to convince some VCs, and then by proxy, everybody believes that you've done a good job.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. And if you look at it without calling out names, a lot of the organizations that we aspire towards utilizing or have opinions on, they're heavily backed VC outfits, right? And to the point where they're instilled on the board. You can't go past, even in today's setting, a web conference or a blog post without them calling out their investors. So they influence it heavily. They really, really do influence it.
I tried to get involved in the venture capital world, and one of the things I ran up against was they said, well, we've already decided to back this horse, so we don't want a tester coming along and telling us that the technology doesn't work because we've made that decision already. And we trust the teams. We think that Fred will take this into a multi-billion-dollar company. We don't really care if the technology does what it says it does.
Yeah. And the reason I feel for that is the reason for that note or feedback is because a VC's emphasis is on exponential growth, right?
Mhm.
So if you're dealing with anyone in cybersecurity, then they know what the capabilities are and they know what they could potentially get it to. And some of them have a strategy. So some of them may already know that they're earmarked for an acquisition or an IPO, or maybe to basically go back to private.
Mm.
If we call out some of the large private equity organizations out there that own 70% of the cybersecurity products on sale today, there's a strategy behind it, and the CEO or the product can't influence that, I'm afraid. I've seen that myself.
Yeah.
We do VC advisories, so we get the same feedback as you, Simon.
Mm-hmm. So when we've worked together in the past with a large, very large, one of the largest organisations in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and yet, despite all of this, we still have customers saying we're considering these 3 or 4 vendors because they're all in a quadrant of an analyst report. So
Mm-hmm.
aren't the analysts enough? Why do we need anything else?
Well, if you look back on our assignment, Simon, this was exactly the point. We trusted the quadrants, we trusted the analyst's view. Then once we put it through your lab, we actually saw what it was really doing. And that's not a fault on the product. It may not be a fault on the analysis, but it just wasn't the right decision for us. So that decision basically helped us with our security posture. It helped us with our budget,
Mm-hmm.
and basically ensured we didn't purchase something to be essentially a beta tester in a large corporate environment.
And actually, that's a really good point, is that, one size doesn't fit all. And so an analyst can say this vendor is going in the right direction. The vendor can say this product does what we're saying it does. But you as a customer might have a slightly different twist on how you want things to go.
Exactly, absolutely. Because we look at, we had a report from a lab, one of your previous competitors, and it scored very, very highly. But for us in, let's say, the oil and gas space, this was highly specialist, and it couldn't satisfy the use cases.
I remember having a discussion with lots of vendors about what customers want, and they had lots of preconceived ideas which they tried to impose on the way that we test. And then I remember when I spoke to you and your team a few years ago, your requirements were the exact opposite of what the vendors were saying customers in inverted commas wanted.
Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is this particular organization had a very forward-thinking view on cybersecurity, because it was an environment which was constantly attacked. Everyone and anyone wanted to get in.
A huge amount of money at stake.
A huge amount of money at stake, $220 billion company. So there were challenges. So our view was more, bottom up. So start from the bottom layer, look at how a product like that could work in all of our ecosystem and not just the white collar worker. Our scenario was our, let's say, personas were much larger than white collar, blue collar worker. We had factories, we had industrial assets, logistics. How do you operate on the sea, right?
Yes. And it felt like you were one of the world's biggest small companies as well, because you had so many very small branch offices spread out all over the world.
Correct. Yeah. And this was one of the major problems that we identified when a simple requirement of reporting. So when we looked at the product with your evaluation as well, we found that the very basic requirements for reporting could not be captured. We couldn't execute those. And the product that we had currently run, whilst it wasn't perfect, it was giving us the insight into where we were going wrong and what we needed to do. And then coming up with AI and machine learning to say it's going to fix all your problems. Well, how am I supposed to take that and put it into a report and go back to the board with it?
Yes.
So
we've just finished some work with quite a well-known bank, and they were looking at changing the incumbent solution for something else, or maybe keeping the incumbent. So a bit similar to what we've done in the past. What we found was their incumbent wasn't actually doing anything at all like they thought it was. So not only are they removing it, they're actually asking for a rebate as well.
That's interesting, because I've actually seen that trend with a few others, where that secret sauce has turned out to be just very, very simple in practice and doesn't warrant the marketing or the price that was applied to it. So no, we've seen the same, to be honest. Yeah.
So I know that you've had lots of experience engaging with, for want of a better word, third-party testers. Are you able to kind of think about what characteristics of those engagements separate the ones that you would want to deal with again and the ones that are perhaps average to poor?
I would say that the ones that offer us transparency in the testing process, not having to go into intricate details to code, but understanding what you're testing and the rationale for testing it. And then the other one is a controversial point. It's around the vendor relationships. We found that in the testing community, a lot of name dropping occurs. And once you're engaged within the community, you'll hear from the vendor side, and you'll be thinking, well, how much truth is in that report? And that's where, sometimes I have a problem with this industry, or this part of the industry, where, of course, everyone is in it for business. Everyone is in it to make money. But at the same time, there's a commitment and a duty to ensure that we all play as one. Even if it's vendor A versus vendor B, we're all dealing with the same issues, right? Where cybersecurity has got to a point of, near, crisis levels, if we look at the SolarWinds attack.
Yeah, I'm thinking that I don't know much about the pharmaceutical industry or even your world of natural resources, but in the cybersecurity industry, the problem is so great that there are conferences where people from competing companies get together and share techniques and tools and approaches. And
Absolutely.
I think it's almost insane, because you think they'd be competing, and of course they do, but the problem is so massive that they have to get their heads together.
Yeah. And that case in point is what I personally appreciate, because when you're going to market for testing, the provider bashing or the competitor bashing, we don't tolerate. It's, we play as one. We're coming to you because we see a particular competence, we want to work with it. But we're not going to stand here and hear you criticize how another organization tests, because that's not, we don't want to go down that route.
So you've had some bad experiences, have you, working directly with testers? So without naming names or being too specific, what have they done wrong? What's got your back up?
So we found on several occasions that the recommendation for a particular testing organization came to us in collaboration with a sales cycle. And basically it comes out that, oh, look, we recommend this as an fully independent thing, and go ahead and vet us against it. We've got nothing to hide. Then what transpires is 3-6 months later, you'll be in a peer discussion, and you'll find that your information was played against the other. So basically, the report, which may have been in draft, was not, let's say, fully approved by us as a customer. Some of that data was already shared with other people who are interested in a particular product, and we didn't really appreciate it. That's not what we signed up to do. It was not part of the NDA, wasn't part of the engagement. So we saw that as shady behavior. And then when we went on to do an additional further independent test, we found evidence that basically this was being configured against a particular standard to make this product look better than it was.
So the tester was being biased in favor of a specific vendor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't take much of a stretch to imagine there's maybe some commercial activity involved
There was,
there.
yes,
Okay.
there was. And to be honest, they did disclose that later and basically, came out with a report on why it happened, how it happened. But by that time, the trust had diminished.
Yeah, but I mean, you got bitten there because you discovered it. I mean, how would you, we worked together, but if you were like starting again, how would you kind of work out who would be best to deal with? Who can you trust from the off?
So I would say, not to be biased with you, Simon, but my expectation would be the way that you're quite public with your reports and your analysis techniques. If we were going to market, I would expect them to behave and act in the same way that your organization does. So we see the full transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, customer engagement. So we would like a form of, I don't know whether you call it an onboarding call or what, but a discovery call, to maybe even get to meet some of your testers, see how they think, because it's apparent that this is becoming such an important aspect. We know that cybersecurity spend has to go up. I've seen at least 2-3 organizations already this year where they've gone to the board and asked for more money for protection. Mm-hmm. So the testing space is very, very critical. And I think selecting the right partner is as important as selecting the right product.
When you come to buy a product, say you're thinking of changing your firewalls or whatever, is it a POC it's called? Is it proof of concept, or what does POC stand for?
Yeah, proof of concept. So the idea would be that you take box A from said vendor, and then basically bring it into your environment where you've mapped out the requirements, and you run the POC as if it was your own.
And so when you do that, when you're comparing a firewall or an endpoint product, why isn't that enough?
Because you want it's a relationship. It's a journey. So another case and example would be that if a product is too perfect from the outset, the life cycle of it, that you're going to invest for 3 to 5 years on that. Can it really run this marathon? Or is it all? Have they provided you everything on day one, and then there's no improvement? There's no method for customer success. There's no method to turn a feature, take feedback to turn it into a feature, giving it to the wider community. That is very, very important. And we found that select few vendors have invested a lot of time, effort, and money into this, and we've seen the benefits. We really have seen the benefits.
And when you run a POC, you are in the hands of the vendors involved, aren't you? So threats that are used are almost certainly going to be ones that they can detect.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That is one issue. However, what we found is if you do a good job of formulating your use cases without the vendor, to really work with your internal operational teams and identify the as-is situation. What is our problem today? Why do we need this? Why are we going out and buying this? Saying, we need to enhance our security posture. It's not good enough, right? No. Pretty much every product will enhance your security posture because it's new by default, right? But how do you live with it? How do you maintain it? How's the relationship? And how structured is the vendor? We've seen quite a lot of change with some of the large players, right? Yeah. Recently, one starting with M, ending with A. We went from being a public company back to a private company, back to a public company. Think of the rigmarole that causes a customer.
Yes.
Think of some of the large acquisitions. People on paper, the product may have been great, but because the organization has changed, it's killed the supply chain, it's killed the support model, and people are trying to get out.
I think as well that some products do develop, but maybe the customers don't notice. So you might have a really good endpoint product that is keeping pace with all the threats, all the current trends in attacks. But someone comes along and says, hey, there's this new thing that's exciting. And what you sometimes see are companies keep adding tools on top of tools on top of tools, rather than really understanding what they've got. And training a team to work with a specific vendor's firewalls, for example, have a look at the features that they've got and are introducing, rather than going, well, there's a next gen thing that claims to solve today's problem, because as you say, they may not solve tomorrow's problem, and you end up with 13 different vendors in your infrastructure.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why the R&D element and customer success should be as equally important to functions of a said product, right? It's a package. You're buying a package. You're not just buying a product.
Please subscribe, and if you enjoyed this episode, please send a link to just one of your close colleagues. If you want to join the DECODED community and access private content, including our monthly executive briefings, apply at decodedcyber.com/circle. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.